Hey guys, it's Tony and welcome back to the Future Week. Now we get to the final part of the trilogy, Back to the Future Part 3. Back to the Future Part 3 started production immediately after Back to the Future Part 2. In fact, at one point, the productions were actually being done simultaneously, with Back to the Future 2 doing its final sound mixing in the summer of 1989, while Back to the Future 3 was being filmed. This actually kind of caused a little bit of a strain on Back to the Future 2 because Zemeckis wasn't there to keep his full attention on it. So that's why they tried their hardest to make Back to the Future 3 a more satisfying sequel than Back to the Future 2, as they found out it wasn't doing so well. Anyway, they decided to do something interesting for Back to the Future 3. As the first two movies kind of focused on Marty and his family problems, they decided this time they were going to focus on Doc. And with that said, it's kind of an interesting idea, but I guess we'll have to see what the plot has to say about it. Back to the Future 3 takes place immediately after Back to the Future 2, after where it left off. Marty runs back to find Doc, 1955 Doc to be precise, after he had sent Marty from the first movie back to 1985. Marty shows up again, this time to tell Doc that he came back from the future and needs Doc's help to get himself back home. Doc goes into a shock and knocks himself out. He then wakes up later in the evening and thought at first it was all a dream until Marty actually shows up and ends up telling Doc everything that had happened, that he had got struck by lightning and got sent back to the Old West. So Doc ends up agreeing to help Marty get himself back to 1985. They find the DeLorean, which Doc had hidden in a cave, but Marty soon discovers that Doc will actually get shot in 1885. By who? Biff's great-great ancestor. Who knew? Buford Tannen. So Marty decides instead of going back to 1985, he decides he's going to go back to the Old West to save Doc. And with that said, Marty goes back to 1885, finds Doc after he almost got hanged, and ends up changing history for what presumably is supposed to be the best, but ends up being the worst, as he ends up becoming the one who has to fight off Buford Tannen instead of Doc. And Doc ends up, as we find out, having his own problems as he ends up falling in love with a school teacher named Clara, played by Mary Steenburgen. With all that said, this is where the plot gets kind of interesting. And when I mean kind of interesting, I mean they're trying to find a way to stretch it, in which the easy answer would have just been, hey, they could have just gotten a DeLorean, got on a train, and left. Actually, that's a plot itself, is how they're actually going to get the DeLorean back home. As Marty finds out that the tank got ruptured, and, well, they have no way of getting home, they try various methods until they decide that, well, a train is fast enough, if you give it the right power, that they could send themselves back to 1985. Well, with that idea in mind, there are now two problems. Marty's got to solve the problem with Buford, and Doc's got to solve the problem with Clara. Doc decides to talk to Clara and tell her the truth that he's from the future, but Clara doesn't take this so well. And she ends up breaking Doc's heart. Doc, depressed by this, finally decides that he must go home now. And this is right after he gets drunk, by the way. Marty, on the other hand, ends up finally having to face off Buford, as Buford tries to shoot him. Marty's secret weapon? Bulletproof vest. Yep, he uses the actual lid to a metal stove and bulletproof vest. He ends up knocking Biff out, finally getting his revenge, and the two decide to head off to the train, heading home. Well, you think the movie would kind of end with them going home, but Clara ends up finding out that Doc was telling the truth, and goes after him. So Doc at one point has to decide whether or not he wants to actually go home, and by the way, this is during the climax, or whether or not he wants to save Clara. What does he end up doing? He saves Clara and ends up staying in the Old West. It's not a bad idea, but, you know, who am I to judge? Marty goes back home, ends up waking up Jennifer, decides not to do the event which was foretold in Back to the Future 2, causes Marty to become a loser in the future, and everything is all hunky-dory. The DeLorean gets destroyed. What a shitload of crap. This is something they would fix up in Back to the Future, the animated series, where they would kind of reveal that the DeLorean got fixed, or Doc built a new one, but in the game they revealed that At one point during their adventures, the DeLorean got duplicated. There are so many ways the DeLorean just came about again. Who knew? With all that in mind, Doc shows back up with the time train and explains to Marty that, well, he and Claire are planning to probably live back in Hill Valley, but they are not sure whether or not to stay in the present or in the Old West. But he does give Marty a present, and the movie ends off with the train showing up and disappearing into time and space, thus ending the entire trilogy. Lovely. So, what do I have to think about this? Many people don't like this one. They say it's the black sheep of the trilogy, just like part 2. Sometimes, I'm going to kind of agree. I don't necessarily hate it. It just was a little too slow. And I can understand. I mean, the idea of doing a Western for your third movie is kind of a little risky, but it was a kind of a good payoff in the same sense. And plus, it was at a time when there weren't that many Westerns out in cinema. Something about it just didn't kind of click with me. Like, I remember first watching it and actually keeping my eye on, like, my phone or on my watch and just thinking to myself, my God, this thing's still going? Maybe it's just me, maybe it's my impatience-ness, but I don't find the movie that bad. It's just, it was way too long. And I feel that there could have been some story ideas that could have been kind of ironed out a little more. And I'm not going to judge Gale and Zemeckis on this one, because I can understand, well, Gale wrote majority of all this out, that they were just trying to, find a way to wrap up the entire series. This was the best they had. And actually, the idea of going to the Old West was actually Michael J. Fox's. So, I guess kudos to him. So with that said, it's an okay sequel. I don't necessarily enjoy it, but I do appreciate that it was trying to just end off on a high note, and it did. So with that said, my favorite scene is actually the final encounter with Buford and just Marty finally getting to knock the crap out of him. Other than that, it's kind of a nice way to wrap up the trilogy, but this is also a nice way that we get to wrap up the trilogy of films reviewed. So with that said, we'll see you next time. We'll be talking about Back to the Future in the home consoles and on television. See you next time.